Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, whether you're in England, Ireland, Scotland, America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. It goes on forever. Loads and loads of love to each and every one of you. I do hope you're doing remarkably well, and special love to all my subscribers. But before we get started, don't forget to get that quintessential drink, because I would love to hear what it is that you drink if it's something very different and special. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Howard, I said, shaking my son vigorously. Stop being such a lazy bum, will you? Wake up! It's already 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Are you going to sleep all day? My son ignored me, emitting a low groan. Oh, leave me alone, Mum, he said, throwing the pillow over his head to block out my nagging voice. I'm trying to get some sleep. I glanced around his bedroom. It was a complete pigsty, with a couple of takeaway pizza boxes strewn across the floor haphazardly, and several empty bottles of finished cereal piled on top of each other. And then there were coffee mugs lying scattered everywhere, on every available surface, from the large mahogany corner desk and both of his side tables. What a complete tip! It certainly didn't help that my son's dirty clothes were strewn across the floor like unwanted pieces of jumble, and they hadn't even managed to make the 4-foot marathon journey all the way to the laundry basket. The lazy sod, I thought resentfully. I felt an indignant anger coursing through my veins, causing my skin to flush with heat. I tried to reason with myself sensibly. He's a teenager, for goodness sake. Don't be so hard on him. This is how teenagers behave. It's all about the hormones. They're all over the place. Well, that's what I'd been told by countless other mothers from my son's school, all who were dealing with the trials and tribulations of raising teenagers. In truth, I never fully appreciated quite how turbulent and rocky the road would invariably become when my son turned 16, as no one warns you about this. It didn't help that I was a single mum, a divorcee raising my child all on my own, while my son visited his father in Hawaii for only 3 weeks once a year. I was secretly relieved that I only had one son, as I didn't know how I would have coped with more than one child. I would have probably been tearing my hair out by now. After Howard was born, I felt rather guilty that he didn't have a brother, but after receiving a radical hysterectomy, brother or sister for Howard wasn't even an option for me, as the choice had been snatched away by the hands of fate. In a strange way, I was rather thankful for small mercies, as managing more than one teenager didn't even bear thinking about. I had noticed that raising Howard had turned my hazel brown hair completely grey, and I was in my early 30s, for goodness sake, and I was now having to dye my hair a dirty blonde colour. Don't get me wrong, I loved Howard more than anything else in the entire world, but his personality was as vacillating and fluctuating like the 4 seasons in a day, and he could go from being bright and sunny to stormy with dark thunderclouds and lightning strikes in almost a matter of seconds. Any mother of teenage children would completely identify with exactly what I'm talking about. Instinctively I gathered his higgledy-piggledy laundry that was tossed so carelessly across the cream carpet into a neat tidy bundle in my hands, trotting down our sweeping staircase until I entered the laundry room, where I quickly piled the rolled-up clothes into the large hollow drum. I was just about to switch on the washing machine when I heard a familiar bleeping sound coming from inside the drum. It was my son's cell phone that I'd so nearly put on the wash cycle. I was horrified, as I knew Howard was attached to his tiny tablet. I knew that I would never see the end of it if I ruined one of his very best friends, his mobile phone. It was hard to assimilate that this tiny piece of metal dictated his entire life, as in any waking moment he was constantly tapping away at it, sending his friends all kinds of text messages. It was hard to fathom that when I was a young girl, no one even owned a cell phone, and yet we managed perfectly fine in those days. But now, if you don't have a cell phone, It was equivalent to being seriously handicapped and impeded physically. I found the offending article tucked in the back pocket of the dark trousers that he'd worn yesterday. I knew he could not have been out last night, as he had a great deal of studying to do, and he had promised me he would apply himself. So what was his cell phone doing in his back trouser pocket, and not doing sitting beside his bed on the side table, which was its usual resting place, unless he was out on the town last night and had surreptitiously snuck out of the house without my knowledge. I wouldn't put anything past him. I'm not by nature a prying or inquisitive person, but I am a concerned mother. Something about my son's cell phone being in the back pocket of his trousers seized my attention, and I had a sneaky suspicion that he had been out last night. It was an ominous feeling that I couldn't shake off, like an irritating bee buzzing around you when you're drinking a sweet drink. I studied the phone and saw there was a message on the screen, and for some reason I could not stop myself from reading it. So I guess that probably makes me moderately nosy. The message read, "Howie, how did last night go for you and Phil? Did you manage to hide in his barn? Did you see him? I told you he's a complete weirdo. I hope he didn't catch you creeping around his property. You were careful not to be seen, weren't you? I told you I wasn't making any of this up. Please let me know what the heck happened. I'm worried you were caught, because you're not answering your phone to me, and neither has Phil. I've phoned you both 8 times already this morning. Please phone me back ASAP." My heart sank when I read the message. What was Howard up to? He knew very well that he was not permitted to go out last night in the wake of his upcoming exams. It seemed to me that he'd been stealthily sneaking around on somebody else's property. This revelation concerned me greatly. What was he doing? I could once again feel a frustrated angst rising up in my chest. I seriously wanted to throttle him. I really did. I stormed up the stairs, carrying a vengeful icy-cold glass of water in one hand and my son's mobile phone in the other. I wanted answers, and I wanted them now, I thought indignantly. My son had some serious explaining to do. Howard, I said, wake up now, wake up. I shook the bunched-up mound under the duvet cover more forcefully than before. Once again my son moaned. "Leave me alone, Mum," he protested in a piqued tone. "I told you I want to sleep," he grumbled, grabbing the pillow to cover his head yet again. I tugged the pillow away from him and threw the icy-cold water over his face. Howard let out a belligerent cry and jumped up from his sleeping position like a jack-in-the-box, wearing a startled expression on his face. "Mum, what the heck are you doing? What did you do that for?" he screamed. "Look what you've done! I'm sopping wet. My hair and my face are soaked." He began to dry his face begrudgingly with a hand towel. "That was seriously mean, Mum. I was trying to get some sleep." "Not any more, you aren't," I piped. "I want answers, Howard. I want them right now. What were you doing sneaking out of the house last night and skulking around in someone's barn? Now that is what I want to know." My son sat up, with a befuddled expression on his face, and his horrified eyes grew as wide as saucers, and his now ashen face became as white as a sheet. "How do you know about that, Mum?" he trembled. Who told you? It didn't mean anything. It was only a bit of fun." "Only a bit of fun," I said. "Only a bit of fun." "Howard, you're not supposed to leave this house. I told you not to. And what were you doing? You were supposed to be studying for your upcoming exams, or have you forgotten that? Furthermore, you can't go trespassing onto strangers' properties in the middle of the night. This is not acceptable behaviour at all. It's a criminal offence. It's called trespassing. You didn't take anything, did you?" "Of course not, Mum. I'm not a thief." "Well, what were you doing then?" My son groaned when he saw me clutching his cell phone, so he knew better than to lie to me about his nocturnal activities the previous night. I assume he realised I'd read all of his texts. I noticed he was trembling anxiously. "All right, Mum. I'll tell you everything," he said, in a resigned voice, surrendering to his fate like a beaver caught up in a trap. "Get dressed now," I said. "Tidy this room up, and after you've eaten your belated lunch, then you can tell me everything. Is that a deal? From the very beginning, mind you, and I don't want you leaving anything out. I need all the details." "Deal," said my son, letting out a heavy sigh, knowing only too well that he would not escape without telling me everything. And the one good thing about Howard was he was a very bad liar, so withholding the truth from me would be as challenging as eating shellfish for him. He just couldn't do it. I returned to my kitchen to prepare a quick lunch for Howard, opening the refrigerator and gathering a bowl of cold Jersey potatoes, which I sliced quickly, whilst I whisked up some eggs with Parmesan cheese to make Howard a Spanish potato omelette, which I placed on the gas griddle to brown. I glanced over the frying pan through the sliding glass doors of my open-plan kitchen that opened out to a large wraparound porch. I could not help but survey the bedazzling landscape that lay beyond the kitchen. I had to admit that the panoramic views overlooking our backyard were utterly spectacular, especially at this vibrant time of the year, when the trees were ablaze with the flamboyant colours from golds to yellows, reds and oranges. Then there were the towering, statuesque Smoky Mountains in the far distance, forming a hazy, purple, almost cloudy silhouette against the azure blue sky, while the contrasting close-up emerald green turf, scattered with clusters of trees, was exceedingly beguiling. I was glad that the grass had not yet turned yellow. Such an exquisitely beautiful day, I mused to myself, that could potentially be cruelly blighted or tainted like a black blotch on the landscape. That was, of course, when Howard finally released the cat out of the bag and told me what was going on. I was not sure I wanted to hear his excuses, protestations and warped irrational reasons for poking around somebody else's barn during the night. All kinds of horrifying thoughts whirled around and around in my head like a Ferris wheel on a children's playground. It could have been worse. Far worse, I reassured myself. He could have actually broken into someone's house. At least it was only a barn, which wasn't quite as bad. But for some reason that thought brought me little comfort. In truth, it changed nothing, absolutely nothing. My son was still guilty of loitering around someone's barn in the middle of the night. I felt woefully ashamed, bashful, embarrassed even. I tried to extinguish what he was going to tell me by drawing a curtain around my mind like the nurses do around a hospital bed. But the proverbial reminders of my son's transgressions badgered my mind like a woodpecker pounding away at a tree, tirelessly with its beak. Procrastination, wrapped up in a quintessential package of distraction, were the ideal tools to help me stop thinking about Howard. I turned my attention to focus on the weather. Summer was drawing to a close, and so I'd eagerly grabbed each warm day, as if it was my last, with a passionate appreciation and zealousness. In a trice the temperatures would drop significantly. There were early signs that autumn was making an early appearance this year. Some of the trees had already shed their leaves, but the red maples in our yard clung on to their leaves, proud of their glorious ensemble of magnificent red-orange leaves that looked like sparkling rubies in the noonday sun, especially the way the flecks of light bounced off the leaves in a reflectant golden blaze. I wallowed in the sunshine with a hungry appetite, like a crocodile sunning himself on a sun-kissed rock, as the pleasurable radiant beam swept through the kitchen, enkindling it in a blissful warm light. It was such a waste to sleep away the daylight hours in a bed, I thought, like my son did, but I was to learn that all teenagers were exactly the same the world over, and sleeping in late went with the territory of being young and carefree. It was so splendid outside. This marvellous weather was not going to last for very much longer. I could already sense the presence of winter loitering around the next corner, like a snow leopard ready to pounce on us with her icy cold presence. As you can expect, like any hungry teenager, Howard finally wolfed down all his potato omelette, which was shortly followed by almost a gallon of ice cream, and then he finally told me that he was ready to talk. I don't quite know if I was ready to listen. I discerned my son seemed rather nervous. His fingers twitched awkwardly. and his eyes appeared somewhat troubled and perturbed. I noticed he was deliberately avoiding eye contact with me, which was never a good sign. He had better not try anything funny with me, or hide anything from me, I thought. He looked distinctly sheepish and very remorseful. Well, you know, Mr. Braxton, he said, dodging my eyes that had remained fixed on him intently, ever watchful for any signs of deception. Of course I know Mr. Braxton, I said. Indeed, everybody in our small American town knew Mr. Braxton, because he was the local eccentric, a slight oddball if you like. He was a tall man of about 6 foot, reasonably well built, long and lanky, with a pair of deep-set beady brown eyes. He was a dignified, upstanding citizen that was rigidly set in his ways, as he would have lunch at the local diner at about 12 o'clock sharp every single day without fail, and order exactly the same food, time after time. 2 sausages, bacon, pancakes, and fried eggs. It never differed. Then his grocery shopping was done equally as regimentally, at precisely 10 o'clock on a Monday morning. He played bridge with a couple of locals every Tuesday night, at about 7 p.m., and every day at about 9 o'clock in the morning he would be seen riding his favourite horse, Tiger Lily, around the countryside, nodding cordially at all the friendly locals who always waved at him. One thing we knew about Mr. Braxton is that he loved horses. Beyond that, no one knew much about him at all, because he barely said boo to a goose, and his conversation was so minimalistic. I think the most he would ever say is good morning, yes, no thank you, and please. That was about as flamboyant as his interaction got with any of the locals. Even during the Tuesday night bridge game, his hosts claimed that he clammed up like an oyster in a shell, and apart from a few grunts, he barely spoke a single word. As you can imagine, all kinds of rumours about him circulated around our town, as the locals were not adverse to engaging in gossip. It would seem that curiosity had reduced many into trying to fill in the missing blanks about Mr. Braxton's mysterious, enigmatic life. "He's a closet gay," someone said, "and his partner is hiding out in the farmhouse." Or he was married 5 times, suggested another person, and has hundreds of divorces behind him. It was all idle speculation, of course, as Mr. Braxton was not forthcoming about himself, and his secret life was cloaked in an aura of mystery. It would seem that in the 20 years he had resided in our part of the world, no one knew a thing about him. "So what is it about Mr. Braxton?" I repeated. "Well, Simon decided to do some undercover investigation," said Howard. "He wanted to break into Mr. Braxton's farmhouse. Well, not break in exactly, climb through the open window and surf through his belongings to learn all about him. There must be photographs hanging around the place, letters and stuff like that, to give us clues about the man. I suppose you could say Simon was being a private detective or a professional sleuth." I raised my brows cynically. "Private detective, please! It's called being a busybody," I said sarcastically. "Simon assumed Mr. Braxton was out of town, as every 2 months he usually stays with his brother over the weekend and gets a local farmhand to care for the horses. Simon thought he must be away." At this revelation, I was absolutely appalled. "So Simon was intending in breaking into Mr. Braxton's house while he was away to do some snooping? Is that what you're telling me? Do you realise that that is a criminal offence? I raised you better than that, Howard. I'm very ashamed." "I wasn't involved, Mum," my son protested indignantly. "Simon did not mean anything by it, Mum. We just wanted to learn about Mr. Braxton, that's all. What's the big deal anyway? It was harmless fun. We weren't hurting anybody. We wanted to find out if he'd been in the Air Force before, because he's so regimental and organised. We also wanted to know if he'd been married. You know, that sort of thing. What's wrong with being interested in the locals, Mum? It's called community spirit." "Is that what you call it?" I said in a sarcastic tone. "You think that breaking and entering into somebody's house and vandalising their personal belongings is acceptable behaviour? Simon was breaking the law, whatever way you look at it. And as for snooping through the poor man's belongings, it makes my skin crawl. You don't behave like that. It's disgusting. How would you feel if Mr. Braxton went ferreting through your belongings and spying on you? Not good, Howard admitted. There you are, then. You don't do it. Such behaviour is reprehensible. If Mr. Braxton chooses to be private, if he wants to be a reserved person, leave him be, for goodness sake. Stop interfering and putting your protrusive, meddling nose where it doesn't belong. Howard rolled his blue eyes to the back of his sockets. He was exasperated with me. I could see that clearly, by the inflamed expression developing on his face. He correctly thought I did not understand. Of course I didn't. If it makes you feel any better, Mum, Simon never broke into his house, he protested. He never got the chance. But he broke into the barn, I piped. What on earth for? No, he didn't break into the barn, snapped Howard. The barn door was wide open. He said he heard a loud crashing sound, and so he crept cautiously into Mr. Braxton's barn to see what the commotion was all about. It sounded like a wheelie bin being thrown over in the wind, or a metal container clanging and hitting the ground very loudly. Simon tiptoed into the barn. He hid behind a large wall of haystacks to see what was going on. He was naturally very curious. He actually thought it was a couple of raccoons messing around the place, looking for scraps. But instead, at the far end of the barn is a long row of built-in square storage containers for the horses, all with sealed lids, holding vast quantities of dried food for them to eat, such as molasses, oats and corn. You know, stuff like that. Anyway, Simon saw a large, dark, hairy figure rifling through the oats and munching them very hungrily. He said he could hear the jaws chomping away. Initially he thought he was observing a scavenging black bear on the prowl, because it was standing up on its haunches. All of a sudden he saw a raccoon boldly dart up to the bear and open his little paws, as if he was expecting a handout from the creature. At this point the bear turned around and placed some oats in the raccoon's hands, as if he had an unlikely friendship with the creature. It was then that Simon realised that this creature was not a bear, but it was Mr. Braxton himself. He was so shocked he could hardly believe it. The man was dressed up in a high-quality ape suit that was very realistic-looking, so much so that it almost had him fooled for a moment. It was a very impressive outfit, must have set him back a pretty sum. He believed that this must be Mr. Braxton's deep, dark, secret fetish, dressing up as an ape-man, and so he was convinced that our theory about Mr. Braxton was very true, that he was indeed a weirdo. I mean, don't they always say that the quiet ones are the ones you have to watch? What I want to know is, how did Simon know it was Mr. Braxton wearing the ape costume? I asked. Because, Mum, he did. He said he could see Mr. Braxton's human face. The man had painted it with shoe polish to give it a leathery look to the skin, along with his telltale long slender hands. Even the large lanky long body shape and height all gave the game away, without a shadow of a doubt. This ape-like humanoid was Mr. Braxton, in a costume, of course. So after Simon told you what he'd seen, you decided you wanted to spy on Mr. Braxton yourself, I suggested. Is that right? Just to have a laugh at the poor man's expense. Hasn't he been through enough already? Well, not really. It was Phil's idea. We didn't have any intention of entering the house, but we did think that it would be fun to see Mr. Braxton dressed up in an ape suit. It seems like such a peculiar fetish to have. I mean, I've heard of grown men dressing up as babies before, or in women's clothes, but getting hot under the collar, wearing an ape suit, well, that's a new one even on me. I suppose we thought it would be rather entertaining. That's my point exactly, I said. You wanted to make fun of poor Mr. Braxton. If the poor man wants to dress up in an ape suit and hang around in his barn eating oats, let him be. Each to his own. It's not for us to judge what he does in his spare time behind closed doors. You boys are terribly mean. What happened, I asked. Did you see Mr. Braxton, as you'd expected? Well, I decided to meet up with Phil at midnight last night. You see, we know how methodical Mr. Braxton is. We assumed he dressed up as an ape at about 12:30, like he did the previous Saturday night. We were sure it was a regular routine for him, as he's always done everything in his life by the clock. I decided to go to sleep early. Sorry, Mum, but my concentration had waned after all that studying. The alarm on my cell phone woke me up at about 10 to 12. I woke up and seriously considered calling our little expedition off, as my bed was so cosy and I didn't want to get up. In truth, I didn't fancy going out at all, but I realised postponing our mission would make me a stick in the mud, or a spoilt sport, and I didn't want that. I quickly slipped out of the house, wiggling through the bedroom window, which I have to say is getting too small for me these days, as I nearly got stuck in between the bars. I grabbed my bicycle from the shed, along with my headlight, and met up with Phil outside the Drage residence. You know, the blue house on the far corner. He wasn't very pleased with me. He said he'd been waiting a good half hour and was beginning to lose his patience. It was awfully chilly for the fall, and I really regretted not wearing a warm jacket because the wind was blowing quite fiercely. Luckily, it was a rather bright night with a full moon along with a silvery cluster of stars, so that had to be a good thing. But it was certainly weird being out on the road at night, because even with the sounds of the crickets and the frogs, it was spooky and creepy out there, alone in that dusky darkness. I was beginning to regret coming out at all, but I never expressed my misgivings to Phil. Anyway, we rode our cycles to Mr. Braxton's farmhouse, and we hid them in the hedgerow. We crept stealthily through the gate as quietly as we could, running towards the barn, hoping with all our hearts not to be seen. To our amazement, the barn door was wide open, and a light was on inside, but I realised it must be motion-activated, and so we guessed that maybe Mr. Braxton was in the barn, doing his ape act. Well, that's what we thought anyway. Phil and I crept behind a large wall of haystacks, and we could see Mr. Braxton, dressed there in his ape suit, seated on the ground with a plastic container in his hands, eating molasses and oats, and sharing some of the food with a friendly tame raccoon, who kept coming up to him with an open paw, asking for more all the time. I must say I was impressed with the ape costume. The face looked remarkably human. But I must say I didn't notice that it was Mr. Braxton's face at all. I didn't actually see the likeness. As you know, Phil has got a dreadful snorting laugh, which is his biggest impediment and downfall. Sometimes he has no way to control it at all, and it's always got us into no end of trouble, especially at school, when the teacher thinks he's laughing at her. I could see his face contort, and he was struggling to suppress his laughter, but he couldn't hold it in any longer, and began to honk with laughter, as he thought it hilariously funny that Mr. Braxton gets his kicks out of dressing like an ape. The worst thing about Phil is when he laughs, it's contagious, because he sounds so dreadful. So I began to laugh as well. "Mum," said Howard, grabbing my hand suddenly and squeezing it very tightly, "I've never known fear like I experienced in that moment. In a second, my laughter had subsided. My mouth just dropped open in astonishment. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I was so shocked. Oh, Mum, it was the most terrifying thing. This thing, he was so angry. I truly think he knew we'd been laughing at him and making fun of him, and he didn't like being humiliated. He was affronted and was standing close to us. So close, far too close for comfort. He was glaring at us with very intimidating brown eyes. Oh, Mum, I could feel his anger. It scared the living hell out of me. The creature was so defiant. He began to beat his chest with his fists as if he was showing us who was in charge.
He rolled back his lips and growled at us, and the sound of that growl, oh, the sound of it! Oh, there are no words to describe it. It was terrifying. Worse, much worse than a lion, 1,000 times worse. I've never felt so vulnerable in all my life. I felt as tiny and as inconspicuous as an ant. I knew that this creature could potentially punch my lights out with one swipe of his arms, and I would be dead. Mum, I wanted to run away as fast as I could. I really did. But my body, it wasn't cooperating with me. I stood there like a lemon, immobilized by terror, unable to move a single muscle. Phil shouted at me. He said, "Run, run." And then I started to flee across the ground towards my bike. I've never got on my bike as fast as I did then. And this thing, it was trailing behind us and breathing so heavily. We were both pedaling on our bicycles so fast as we possibly could. And this creature, oh, Mum, I nearly had a heart attack. This creature grabbed the bike, lifted it off the ground with me on it. Oh, I began to scream, and that was when I realised the creature had lifted my bike over a pothole, and he put my bike back onto the flat ground. "He stopped you from falling?" I gasped. "That's right. I could hardly believe it, Mum. I thought I was dead." "But you aren't, are you?" I said, cradling my son tenderly in my arms. "You're absolutely fine. What happened next?" Then he grabbed Phil's bike, and he pointed at Phil with his long arms, bending his head towards Phil and growling at him. Phil began to scream at the top of his lungs. The next thing I knew, we heard gunshots, and it was Mr. Braxton. He was standing there firing randomly in the air after the creature, and it fled away. It fled and ran into the woods as fast as it could. It sped away like grease lightning. It sounds to me as if the creature was giving Phil a piece of his mind and saying, "Don't you dare laugh at me or make fun of me." "That's what Phil thinks," said my son. "Mr. Braxton invited us into his house for cocoa, but he never said a word to us. He didn't even ask us if we were all right, nor did he question us about the strange creature holding down Phil's bike and challenging him. He didn't ask us why we were on his land even. It was weird. He is weird. I'm sorry, Mum, but he is. He said nothing, but of course we are grateful to him for scaring away the creature. It ran like the wind into the woods. We used a random excuse to Mr. Braxton, telling him we needed to relieve ourselves, and could he show us where his toilet facilities were. It was our opportune moment to learn about his life and to have a good snoop around his property. We were heartily disappointed. As we looked around his minimalistic, meticulous home, there wasn't a photograph in sight or anything to tell us a snitch about his life, so it still remains a mystery. That event happened over 20 years ago. My, doesn't time fly? I realised the creature my son encountered was most certainly a Bigfoot. It would seem he wasn't happy about being humiliated, but he clearly had a good heart, because the raccoon trusted him, which is a good sign. He also lifted my son and his bicycle over a pothole, which would have tripped him up in the middle of the night. Yes, he wasn't happy with Phil laughing at him, which makes him seem almost human, as none of us enjoy being belittled and humiliated. And as for Mr. Braxton, he always remained the mysterious eccentric in our small town. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, that was a fabulous story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.